Alrighty, so this is a video tutorial to cover all of the stuff that we talked about yesterday in class on how to go through and complete the first part of this introduction to typography. So in this video, I'm going to cover all of the different steps here, from adding text to a Photoshop document, changing the font size and color, adding effects such as a drop shadow to the text and gradient through the blending options menu, as well as how to warp text by using the default text warps or warping text by converting it to a shape and manipulating those points with the path and direct selection tools. So to get started on this assignment, you're going to open up Adobe Photoshop, create a 8.5 by 11 inch document with the title your last name underscore typography or type practice. And you're going to follow along as I demonstrate the individual steps. So since this is a video tutorial, you're going to try the steps that I show. You can pause the video when you need to, restart, rewind, whatever you need to do. So to get started, make sure you are opening up Adobe Photoshop on your computer. And then from the Adobe Photoshop homepage, we're going to go over to File, New, and we're going to create a document that's 8.5 by 11 inches. I'm going to lower down the resolution to 72. It should be that by default if you're in the old version of Photoshop. And again, I'm going to name this document my last name underscore type practice. Everything else we can leave the same, and when we hit create, it'll create our new document. And everything I am going to show you during this little video tutorial will be applicable on both the old and current versions of Adobe Photoshop. So let's get started with some text. First things first, to add text to our Photoshop document, you're going to use the text tool or the type tool, which you can find on our toolbar. It looks like the letter T. You can also activate the tool by just clicking T on your keyboard. And when you have the tool activated, you can see here my cursor looks like the little text symbol with a box around it. And that box basically means that wherever I click, it'll create a text box, and I can go and start typing out some words. So by default, your words aren't going to look like mine. If I go and reset them, it'll look something more like this. And you're going to notice that by default, the text here is pretty boring, it's pretty small, and it's also just black in color. So the first thing we want to do is we want to go through and change it so that we can have it in a more interesting font, a bigger size, and a more colorful color. So to do so, with that type tool still activated, I'm going to select my text by either clicking and dragging, double clicking, or selecting it and pressing Control and A. With that text selected, I then have a few ways to change all of these different aspects. If you're on the old version of Photoshop, you'll do so at the top of the screen over here. I can select a font from the font menu. Doesn't matter too much which font you select. I'm just going to go through and pick one that I know I really like. In the new version of Photoshop, you can find it in the decorative section, and it is called the Modoc Regular. Doesn't matter which font you choose though, choose whichever one you want. Now, you'll be able to change, if you're on the new version of Photoshop, these settings from this little drop-down menu as well. So if I click the font right here, you can see it's the same exact menu that pops up. You just have more options for where to choose from. To change the size of the text, I'll change the point value. So by default, it's set to 25 for me. The larger the point value, the larger the text. You can see I made it so big there, it's currently going off the screen. And with the selection tool, you can also select text and drag it smaller with your normal transform controls. But I'll just go and select that text again. And you'll realize that when I have the text selection tool, you see if I hover outside of that text, that little square pops up around the text cursor, meaning that if I click again, it's going to create a new text box. However, when I hover this over text that I've already created, you see that little circle, or square rather, disappears. And this means that I'm going to edit text that I already have here. So if I click on here again, I can highlight my words. And this time, I'm going to lower the text size back down to about 72. And then the final thing we can do around here is we can change the size of the text. So again, make sure I have my text tool selected. I can highlight the text. I can click this box. This opens up my color picker, and I can choose to make this text whatever color that I want. Pretty simple, pretty self-explanatory, and not that much different than doing this in something like a Word or a slideshow document. So to go back over, the next thing that we're going to do is, now that we've added text with a non-default font and color, we're going to also start doing some effects to text, starting with adding a drop shadow. So to add a drop shadow, I'm going to grab my text tool again. I'm going to go and create a new text box underneath what I've already written here. And I'm just going to type in my name again. Now to add the drop shadow, what we're going to do is we're going to right click on the text layer. And one thing you'll notice is that whenever I add a new text box, it's going to create a new text layer over on my layers panel here. So whatever text that we added most recently will always go to the top of our layers panel. So I'm going to select that top bit of text right here. I'm going to right click it, and I'm going to select blending options. Now, if you don't see blending options from this menu, if you're on the new version of Photoshop, it'll be over at the top. What could have happened is you right-clicked on the thumbnail of the layer. So if you see I click right here on the T thumbnail, I actually do have that blending options. I actually didn't realize that. So I should be able to right-click up there. Ooh, and it pops right up. You learn something new every day. But whichever way you do, right-click on the layer, select blending options, and then this layer style menu will pop up. So from this layer style menu, make sure you have preview set on, so any changes that we make from here we'll actually be able to see. And I'm just going to kind of zoom in a little bit and maneuver this window so I can better see what effects I'm applying here. So the effect that we're going to apply is a drop shadow. And you'll notice one thing that is that if I click the little checkbox right here, it's going to apply the shadow, but I'm not going to get the options over here where I can go through and change the aspects of the shadow. So to do so, I'm going to make sure I click on the word drop shadow itself. You'll see the little layer style menu will change. And now I have options to manipulate the shadow that's appeared around my text. Now again, mine will look a little bit different since I've edited this menu before, so I'm going to hit reset to default. And by default, that's what your shadow underneath your text should look like. It's very faint, it's very fuzzy. So we're going to go through and mess around with the settings over here to make it a little bit more visually interesting. So the first setting that I'm going to mess around with is the opacity. This is going to change how see-through the shadow is. So if I lower the opacity down, you can see it's kind of transparent, and as I bring it up all the way, it'll get darker and darker and darker. The next setting that I'm going to mess around with is the distance. So this is how far the shadow is from the words. So if I bring it down real far, you can see it gets further and further away from the text. I'm just going to nudge it slightly. And this will better allow me to show the angle, which is the direction that the shadow is appearing from the text. So the way to think about it is this little line right here represents where your light source is coming and hitting your text layer in this case. So if I bring this little line and point it up, What that is saying is that the light source that's casting the shadow is above the text, and it's coming down and casting a shadow beneath it. If I move this to the left, the shadow will pop out the right. Vice versa, if I move it to the right-hand side, it'll pop out the left. And you can change this angle to be wherever you want. I'm going to put the angle, though, a little bit in the northwest direction. And then I'm going to continue to mess around with some of the other settings here. So spread is the next one. This determines how essentially fuzzy or out of focus that shadow is. So again, if it's all the way to the left, it'll be a really soft, fuzzy shadow. If I bump it up all the way to the right, it's going to be a lot more of a solid color. And then finally, size of the shadow is going to determine how big or small that drop shadow is. And by messing around with these settings, you can get this really interesting 3D effect to it. And if I want to make it even a little bit more convincing, I can change the color of the shadow by clicking this box right here and selecting whatever color I want from the color picker. If you want to create a really convincing 3D effect, with the color picker open, you'll see that if I move off to the side, I get that eyedropper tool. So whatever I click on, it'll change the color to it. So if I click on the blue that I've made my letters, I can decrease the brightness of that color, make it a bit darker. And I can get this really interesting 3D effect where the letters themselves are nice and bright, and I get this really dark shadow underneath that gives it a little bit of depth and dimension. So that's adding a drop shadow. The next thing that we're going to do is we're going to go through and apply some other blending effects. So one more time, I'm going to grab my text tool. I'm going to click. I'm going to type in my name again, move it, resize it if I want by either clicking and dragging with the transform tool or just setting the point value in the text box. But the next thing that we're going to do is, again, once we have this new bit of type activated, you see it's on its own layer. I'm going to right-click that layer, pop back into the blending options. And this time, what we're going to do is apply a gradient overlay. Again, when you apply the gradient overlay, it'll look something more like this. So you see here, our text is going to go from this gray to this light or bright white color. And a gradient is essentially just a shift in color. So if I click this little drop-down menu, I can view some of my other gradient options. These are sorted by color. So for example, I can go into the pastel gradients, and now I get a bunch of different pastel color schemes. And if I select one, it'll apply that color scheme to my text here. And again, a gradient is just simply a shift in color in a really smooth transition. Now, if I want to customize these colors even more, I don't like this blue to pink gradient, I can click on the actual gradient color right there, which will pop open the gradient editor. And here I can customize it. So again, you see right now we have a gradient that's going from this kind of purpley, light purple color to this pink color over here. If I want to change this, I can select this color stop. I can then select the color box down here, which opens the color picker and will allow me to change the color of that text. So if I wanted to, I can make it orange to whatever color I can think of. Maybe I'll make it a dark purple. And there are a couple other things that you can change in this gradient editor. The first off is the gradient style. So you can make it a radial gradient, and you'll get a little preview in the layer style menu here. So you see now the gradient's starting in the center and spreading outwards. You can change the scale of this gradient, which will make it spread slower or quicker. And there's a couple other different options as well. So you have an angle gradient, a reflected gradient, and a diamond gradient. And just like you could with the shadow, you can also adjust the angle of this gradient. So if I set it back to a linear, I can change this angle around, and as you can see in the preview or on the word itself, it's changing the direction the gradient is. So if I move this up to the top, I'm going to get a gradient that goes from the top down to the bottom. If I move this to the left or right, I'll get a gradient that goes, in this case, from the left to the right. In addition to that gradient overlay, I also encourage you just to kind of click on some of these other options as well. Some of them include a bevel and emboss, which again is another type of 3D effect to it. You can apply a stroke, which applies an outline around your text. Inner shadows are a little bit more subtle. Same thing with the glows, but they apply, again, other additional effects. And within any of these, you can open them up and continue to mess around with them. See what happens. And you can totally go crazy and apply all the different effects. But as you see, some of the effects kind of contrast with each other. So it's best not to go too crazy with them, but I do encourage you to just click around and see what they do. And now we're almost in the final stretch. So by now I've shown you how to add text and make it the non-default font and color. We've shown you how to add text with a drop shadow, with a gradient. How to convert text to a shape is what we're going to do next. And afterwards, we'll go ahead and show you how to warp text. So same thing, I'm going to go underneath my words up there. I'm going to grab my type tool. I'm going to click down below to create a new text box. And again, I'm just going to type in my name. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to convert this text to a shape. So on my layer down here, this is where it is very important. If you click the thumbnail, you're not going to get the option. But if you right click on the text layer anywhere besides the little thumbnail right here, you're going to get the option from this menu to convert that text to a shape. Now, one thing to know is when we convert text to a shape, we're not going to be able to edit it. So if I hover my cursor over here, you see that I'm not going to get that symbol where it allows me to go through and change what this text says. However, if I hover my mouse over some of this other text that is still a text layer, I can open that text layer and continue to type out stuff onto it. But this text layer down here that we converted to a shape, we won't be able to do that, and we know we won't be able to do because if you look at the thumbnail right here, it changed from that T symbol representing a text layer to this symbol right here representing a shape layer. So why would we make it a shape layer? Well, because we have more control. So to edit shape layers, we have two different tools underneath our text tool. We have our path selection tool. This tool will allow us to go through and making sure that we have that shape layer selected. We can click on these letters and move them around independent of one another. So this is a good way to play around with the spacing of your letters. Now, although we don't have the text features here, we can still change the color of these shapes by going up to where it says fill, and whatever color we select, it'll change the color of the letters. And if we want to, we can also apply a stroke to those letters, which just like the stroke in the blending options or in Adobe Illustrator, provides an outline around those letters. Now, if we do want to say change one letter to be its own color, what we need to do is we need to separate that shape or that letter and put it on its own layer. So say in this case, I want the letter D right here to be green. What I'll do is using my path selection tool, I'll select the letter, I'll go to Layer, New, Shape Layer via Cut. That's going to cut this letter out and paste it on its own layer now. And now if I select this letter and change the color of it, say to green, I hit OK, and now that letter is its own color, different from the others. The other thing that we can do to these letters once we make them into shapes is we can use the direct selection tool. So the difference between these two selection tools right here, and you can activate this little menu by right-clicking on one of them, is the direct selection tool, or sorry, the path selection tool, the one we were just using, lets you select the entirety of a shape. If we right-click, the direct selection tool will let us select the individual anchor points that make up these shapes and move and stretch them around. This is a really good way to start customizing the shapes. So for example, on this letter I right here, I can take whatever point I want out of it and start stretching it around to make weird little bits and bobs and kind of customize the shapes. And if you want to as well, you can select multiple of these little nodules by clicking and dragging your mouse, creating a selection box, and then clicking and dragging those selected shapes or selected anchor points to really stretch out those letters in interesting ways. And currently, since I have this layer selected with only the I, N, and N, I won't be able to edit the letter D. So if I want to maneuver around this letter right here, since we put that on its own layer, I just have to select that layer. I can then click the edge of the shape to bring up those points. And like I said, I can start selecting those different anchor points and maneuvering them around. This is a good way to make the holes in letter bigger. So if you want to make, say, the little gap in this D section bigger, you can really easily do so by manipulating these anchor points. But what if you want to go and warp your text without having to go through and individually move and edit all of these little letters? Well, luckily for you, there are easy ways to also warp your text in some really default manners. So for the final thing I'm going to do, I'm again going to just kind of quickly move these up a little bit to get more space. And I'm doing so by just using my selection tool. So once you have the text layers created, you can just move them like you would any other layer. This time though, I'm going to grab my type tool one last time. I'm going to go and type my name one more time. And at the top of the menu here, when you have the type tool selected, you're going to see this little button that looks like the letter T on a hill. And this is the warp text button. When I click it, it'll bring up the warp text menu, and then I can choose a bunch of different ways to warp my text around. The main one I'll do is the arc. Again, if I select that, it'll arc my text. And then I have all these sliders I can manipulate around to arc it more or less and in different directions. You can mess around with the horizontal distortion to make one end bigger, one end smaller, and the vertical distortion to do that with the top and bottom of the text. There's a lot of weird options that you have in here. There's always the fish option for some reason. But the main ones that you would most likely use would be the first 7 up here, mainly the arcs, which let us really seamlessly get that text to bend around things. And with that being said, at this point, we've really covered over everything for today. Again, we've shown you how to add text with that non-default font and color, drop shadow, gradients. We've shown you how to convert it to a shape and warp it around, and warp it with those default warp options. So from here on out, we're going to make sure that we save this document as a Photoshop document file. And then we export it by going to File, Export, Export As, and exporting it as a PNG or a JPEG. Once you do that, you're going to go back to our MyMCPS Classroom page and open up the Week 1 module. In there, I have the YouTube playlist posted. And like we said, you're going to go through that playlist, find a tutorial that looks interesting to you, and then try and follow along with it as you type in your own name. So if I go over to that playlist, it's called Typography Practice.
My name is Monica Zagroberna, and this is how to create.
You can see here we have a lot of different options for you to choose from. And if you need help with any of them, just make sure to let me know, and I'll be right around to assist.